dancing down the hallway in darkness. When I was in my second year in college, I stayed in an all-boys hostel. I made many friends, and we were all very happy to be in school away from our conservative parents. The hostel was so much fun. It was a very, very old building, and there was only electricity in the rooms themselves. Sometimes candles would be placed on the sills along the windows of the corridors if a watchman was present. But normally, once you left the rooms, you'd be faced with complete darkness. It was common to wake a buddy if you needed to walk down to the restroom at the end of the hall. We all had a childish fear of being alone in the dark. One night, I had to use the restroom. It was about 4 a.m. I went over to my friend's bed and shook him gently. His eyes snapped open as soon as I touched him. I apologized for bothering him, but told him I needed to pee. He just smiled and hopped out of bed. All the way down the hallway he laughed and danced and jigged. I could barely see him, but I could hear the shuffling of his feet, the snapping of his fingers, and his quiet chuckling, and it was very calming. I laughed too as I shook my hips just like him and sauntered down the hallway into the darkness. He said nothing to me, though occasionally I heard him hum one of our favorite tunes from the movies. The same thing happened on our return. I got back to bed and I fell asleep quite easily. I woke fairly late the next morning to the sound of men in our room. They surrounded his bed and I leapt up, prepared to protect my friend. Then I realized they were the college administrators. I peered through them to the bed. My friend's lifeless eyes were fixated on my bed, that same smile on his face. Suicide. His time of death was 11:30 p.m., almost 5 hours before I woke him. This man. January 2006. In New York, the patient of a well-known psychiatrist draws the face of a man that has been repeatedly appearing in her dreams. On more than one occasion, the man has given her advice on her private life. She swears she has never met the man at all in real life. The portrait lies forgotten on the psychiatrist's desk for a few days, until one day, another patient recognizes the face and says that the man often visited him in his dreams. He also claims he has never seen the man in his waking life. The psychiatrist decides to send the portrait to some of his colleagues that have patients with recurring dreams. Within a few months, 4 patients recognize the man as a frequent presence in their own dreams. All of the patients refer to him as this man. From January 2006 until today, at least 2,000 people have claimed to have seen this man in their dreams in many cities all over the world. Los Angeles, Sao Paulo, Tehran, Beijing, Rome, Barcelona, Stockholm, Paris, New Delhi, Moscow, etc. At the moment, there is no ascertained relationship or common trait among the people that have dreamt of seeing this man. Moreover, no living man has ever been recognized as resembling the man of the portrait by the people who have seen this man in their dreams. The Gateway of the Mind. In 1983, a team of deeply pious scientists conducted a radical experiment in an undisclosed facility. The scientists had theorized that a human without access to any senses, who couldn't perceive any stimuli, would be able to perceive the presence of God. They believed that the 5 senses clouded our awareness of eternity, and without them, a human could actually establish contact with God by thought. An elderly man, who claimed to have nothing left to live for, was the only test subject to volunteer. To purge him of all his senses, the scientists performed a complex operation in which every sensory nerve connection to the brain was surgically severed, although the test subject retained full muscular function. He could not see, hear, taste, smell, or feel. With no possible way to communicate with or even sense the outside world, he was alone with his thoughts. Scientists monitored him as he spoke aloud about his state of mind and jumbled slurred sentences that he couldn't even hear. After 4 days, the man claimed to be hearing hushed, unintelligible voices in his head. Assuming it was an onset of psychosis, the scientists paid little attention to the man's concerns. 2 days later, the man cried that he could hear his dead wife speaking with him, and even more, he could communicate back. The scientists were intrigued, but were not convinced, until the subject started naming dead relatives of the scientists. He repeated personal information to the scientists that only the dead spouses and parents would have known. At this point, a sizable portion of scientists left the study. After a week of conversing with the deceased through his thoughts, the subject became distressed, saying the voices were overwhelming in every waking moment. His consciousness was bombarded by hundreds of voices that refused to leave him alone. He frequently threw himself against the wall, trying to elicit a pain response. He begged the scientists for sedatives so he could escape the voices by sleeping. This tactic only worked for 3 days, until he started having severe night terrors. The subject repeatedly said that he could see and hear the deceased in his dreams. Only 1 day later, the subject began to scream and claw at his non-functional eyes, hoping to see something in the physical world. The hysterical subject now said the voices of the dead were deafening and hostile, speaking of hell and the end of the world. At one point he yelled, "There's no heaven! No forgiveness!" for 5 hours straight. He continually begged to be killed, but the scientists were convinced that he was close to establishing contact with God. After another day, the subject could no longer form coherent sentences. Seemingly mad, he started to bite off chunks of flesh from his arm. The scientists rushed to the test chamber and restrained him to a table so he could not kill himself. After a few hours of being tied down, the subject halted his struggling and screaming. He stared blankly at the ceiling as teardrops streaked across his face uninterrupted for 2 whole weeks. The subject had to be manually rehydrated due to the constant crying. Eventually, he turned his head and, despite his blindness, made focused eye contact with a scientist for the first time in the study. He whispered, "I have spoken with God, and he has abandoned us." His vital signs stopped. There was no apparent cause of death.